Hello and good evening, everyone. Today I'm speaking to a journalist. He's an author of several books. He's the host of the Power Hungry podcast and a filmmaker of a very interesting film called The Juice that's about electricity in general. So, yeah, I'd like to welcome Robert Bryce.
Well, Hugo, thanks for having me on. Great to see you again. Always enjoy our discussions.
So, Robert, I sort of want to dig into this topic of energy. Topic tonight is sort of energy in general. You've been covering energy, what's it now, for over 30 years, if I understand it correctly.
That's right. Yeah.
And how do you see the big picture energy scene globally?
Well, how long do we have, Hugo? um, how do I see the big picture? What I see a lot of hype, honestly. I see a lot of hype around, oh, we're going to change and we're going to move to renewables. But when I look at the numbers, and this is something I pride myself on, I work very hard to make sure that I, come at this from a defendable standpoint of where are the numbers and what are the trends. But we hear this hype around the energy transition, but I see no evidence of it actually happening. I mean, you're in France, you're in Paris. You see all over Europe a rush back to coal because of what happened with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the lack of now Russian gas not flowing into Europe. We see all over Asia the rush back to coal. India this year said they're going to increase their coal burn by 8% this year in India. China is still building about one new coal plant a week. That's not my figure. That's a global energy monitor. So this talk about, in the US, we're going to ban natural gas stoves. We're going to ban the use of natural gas in homes because we have to save the climate. When you look at the big picture, the reality is, and I say this with, I think it's a very defendable statement. It doesn't really matter what the US does anymore because of the growth that is happening in the rest of the world, particularly in Asia and in India, and the level of energy poverty globally. So I think, generally what I see, big picture, hydrocarbons are still very dominant globally. Renewables, yes, they're growing, but they're not stealing significant market share away from hydrocarbons, at least not, they haven't thus far. They might in the future. And then also, I think the big mega trend, and one that I'd like to talk about too, is what's happening with nuclear, because if we're serious about reducing emissions, we have to get serious about nuclear energy. And I think the US is where the other countries are stealing a march on the US in this regard, that China, India, China, Russia, South Korea, even in France, where the French government is saying we're going to rededicate ourselves to nuclear energy. I think this is one of the most intriguing trends globally.
So I sort of want to, sort of just unpack that a little bit.
Sure.
Let's start with the renewables. So the argument in favor of them have been efficiency, essentially. If you read Amory Lovin's, his argument has been that you don't lose the 2/3 of energy in renewables. So theoretically, you can use less of them and get more from less. And on the condition that we insulate our homes, etc., all this heat pumps, all that story together, you'd get a much better picture. And then he makes the argument that you can put interconnectors everywhere and you can have the right combination of wind and solar. So, what do you sort of throw back at that argument?
Well, he's been, Amory Lovins has been consistent, and he's been consistently wrong for 50 years. And yet the entity that he created, the Rocky Mountain Institute, just came out this last month with this, I'll use the word bullshit study, claiming that there were 12.7% of American children were getting asthma because of natural gas stoves. It wasn't true. It wasn't even remotely true. And the RMI's own people walked it back and said, we're not suggesting a causal relationship. Well, this is after all of these headlines, all of this effort to ban the use of natural gas in homes. Never mind that the use of gas in homes in America hasn't changed in 50 years. In 1970, the US was consuming 5 trillion cubic feet of gas per year in residential use. It's the same number today. And yet this is somehow the big climate bogeyman. It doesn't make any sense. So, but I digress for a moment, because I think it's key to put Lovins and his work in context, in that he's had this soft path, this idea of what we're going to run everything with wind and solar, and his progeny, including Mark Jacobson at Stanford, his work has been routinely debunked, that we're going to run it with hydro and wind and solar. It can't be done, Hugo. There's no way. There's not enough land. You can't build enough high voltage transmission. These are the key constraints. They're basic land use. The binding constraint on the growth of renewables is land use. Part of it is the project siting itself. And we see all across Europe and rural America, local communities saying, we don't want these. And then the other problem is you can't build enough high voltage transmission to connect it, even if you could build all that capacity, because it's so difficult to build high voltage transmission, which is a story I'm working on now and we'll publish tonight and on or tomorrow morning on Substack.
But I mean, you've been one of the few journalists who've been, at least giving way to the counter narrative, and maybe sort of explain to us the opposition that there is in the United States against, building these things all over the place.
Well, I think it's the same in Europe. I mean, you're seeing it in rural France. You're seeing it in rural Germany, where in Bavaria, in Germany, the local communities have passed bans on wind projects. They can't build high voltage transmission. So this isn't a uniquely American issue. In Australia, there's a company that is trying to build high voltage transmission, and the local communities are so opposed that, in fact, the trucks that the employees of the transmission company, they're afraid to go into some of these rural communities because the locals are so hostile. So these are real concerns, and why do I report on it? Well, because, Hugo, I care. I spend a lot of time in rural America. I speak to a lot of rural electric cooperatives. I'm going to Sioux Falls, South Dakota in May to talk to a local joint action agency that supplies power to local municipalities. I care about these people. These are the people that, I care about people who turn wrenches and who make things, who grow things, who fix things. Those are my people. And the legacy media outlets don't care about them. They're these reporters from these big media outlets. They live in the coastal cities and they don't give a thin goddamn about what happens in rural Ohio or Nebraska. They don't have any people there. They don't care about them. Well, I do. And it's important that we put their property rights, their focus, their livelihoods matter, and to discount them, which has been done routinely, is a big mistake. And so it's one of my jobs, I think, to make these people more visible and make their concerns more visible. And I've had, I think, a little success at it.
Yeah, and I mean, the last article I read that of you has been we spoke a little bit about Lovins. It's sort of a giveaway that he would, promote the asthma study that is bunked from the get-go. But, you've sort of pointed out that there is a green oligarchy, if you will, that is actively funding, these type of projects. And, if you oppose it, you deny the climate, or you're basically kicked out of the tribe type of rhetoric. That's sort of what's coming from it. So how do you speak to that point?
Well, I would quote Groucho Marx, who said, I don't want to be part of any club that would have me. So I don't need a tribe. I'm happy with the tribe of one. You have to be one of the things that in my career, I've been in journalism. I've never had a real job. I've been a reporter my whole career, really. You have to be independent. You have to think independently. You have to think for yourself. And I pride myself on that. And as far as being ostracized, or, they call me names, or you don't like what I'm writing. Well, okay. So what? Then you do your own reporting. I do my own. I don't depend on anyone. I get routinely these allegations. Oh, you're working for somebody else. No, I work for myself. I bust my ass. How do I support myself? I do public speaking. I do speaking engagements all over the country. I have a dozen that I've already scheduled for this year, and we're only on February 7th. And I get paid well to do it, so I can afford to be independent. And that's I take great pride in that I can afford to do this because, and I don't have a sponsor for my podcast. I fund it out of my own pocket because I prize that independence. And that's what so much of these legacy media outlets and these big NGOs who are funded with hundreds of millions of dollars, they are pushing this narrative, and they're being very successful at it. But I'm happy to counter it because very few others are.
And it's just shocking to me that the exact same people who are skeptical, and maybe rightfully so, against the military industrial complex can't, critique the NGO industrial complex, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. And it is incredibly powerful, Hugo. I mean, the NGO corporate climate industrial complex, I mean, the backing, and I wrote about this about 10 days ago on Substack, the billionaires behind the gas bans. they these NGOs, these climate NGOs, I don't call them environmental groups anymore because I don't think they're environmentalists. If you're promoting the landscape destroying, wildlife destroying sprawl of wind and solar, you're not pro wildlife, you're not pro environment. And so they're NGOs, they're climate activists, and they are funded to the tune of billions of dollars. And the amount of money that they have relative to the associations and nonprofits that are promoting traditional energy, I'll say it that way, hydrocarbons and nuclear, the ratio of funding for the climate in NGO climate industrial complex, we're talking about a factor of 4, 5, or 6 times more money that they're collecting and spending than the traditional energy nonprofits. It's just not even close.
And this sort of ties well into where I want to go with this conversation, which is
Sure.
nuclear. I looked at the German Energiewende. I think it's something like $500 billion that's been spent, give or
Yeah.
take.
Yeah.
Now, the most expensive nuclear power plant, Hinkley Point, which has gone over budget, held managed to the ground, I think is 20 billion. Okay.
Yeah.
So, you could have built 40 of those and potentially solve Germany's carbon emission problem, assuming we go for the most expensive project in nuclear, right? The one that you should not be doing. And it's just that calculus has never been done for any of these things, right?
Well, and I think what's lost in these things, oh, well, it's so expensive. Well, okay, but what's the value? Right. And so there's this cost, the pro renewable crowd, they'll say, well, the levelized cost of new electricity from wind and solar is only 3 cents or 5 cents or whatever it is. Okay. So you're saying that's the cost. What's the value? And is this, oh, well, that's the cost, and that wind turbine is going to last how long? 10 years, 15 years. You build a nuclear plant, it will run for 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years. And the value that it provides to the society of having baseload, reliable, affordable, resilient electricity is enormous. And so we have to be careful, and it's lost in a lot of the media discussions about what's the cost and what's the value, and what is the value to the society, and what is the cost to the society of unreliable electricity. And you're South African, you know this very well, that you can't build a strong, resilient economy if you don't have a strong, resilient electric grid. And electric grids are a near perfect reflection of the society they power. And bad governance breeds bad electric grids, and corruption is, as I say, theft is the enemy of light. And so, that is one of the key problems around the world in developing countries, is that there's a lot of corruption, and that means poor electricity systems.
And you sort of pointed this out in your film in Juice. I mean, I saw Puerto Rico is a very good example. Lebanon, I mean, maybe explain about that Lebanese mafia a little bit. That was quite interesting.
Sure. I'd been wanting to go to Beirut my whole life, and because I'd heard about it so many times, the Paris of the Middle East. We went there in 2016, and it was a remarkable place. I'm sorry, 2017. Amazing people, right? And a beautiful country, and the beautiful people, and the food was amazing. But their economy is a mess. And it's because you have by law, they split the government among the Shiites, the Sunni, and the Maronite Christians. So I forgot which, but one of them owns is the premier. One of them controls the assembly, or the House, and the other controls the Senate, if memory serves. But they have 3 branches of government, and each religious faction controls one of those arms of government. And so it's a corruption free for all. And so what does that mean in terms of the electric grid? And it's much worse now, that since the port explosion, let me be clear. And the economy was in tatters before, but the port explosion just shattered the economy. So essentially everyone in Lebanon pays 2 electric bills, one to the generator mafia and one to EDL, Électricité du Liban, which is the grid operator. But EDL cannot provide power 24/7. So people pay 2 bills, one to EDL and one to the generator mafia, which is the local guy or local company that has a generator in their neighborhood, and they run a power line into your home. And one of the things that's interesting about that is they don't use a traditional meter for watt hours. They charge you for amperage, because that's how they have to allocate power. They are selling amps. They're not selling watt hours. And that's, to me, is an interesting point, because it's very clear they're selling a service, not a commodity, which is what I think one of the problems of how we see electricity in America is. That's where we're selling it like a commodity. It's a service.
So do you think we can actually learn, I mean, something from Lebanon in that regard? That
Oh,
should be a
I
sense.
hope so, because I think that is key to getting the kind of reform that we need for policymakers to have better policy around the electric grid.
You've been, so it's just to put a little bit back to nuclear. I mean, you've been a proponent, I think you call it end-to-end, natural gas to nuclear transition. So why, are you, betting, in favor of nuclear? Because, if I look at the costs of these plants, I mean, to be fair to them, especially in the US and in Europe, they haven't been all that great, those projects.
Well, and it's a fair criticism, and I will accept that, and it's an incredibly difficult problem to overcome. And what we are facing in the U.S. is this first of a kind issue, right? That the plant Vogels, the reactors 3 and 4, these are the first of their kind now to be built in the U.S. in decades. And then we had the Summer plant in South Carolina that was canceled, and ratepayers are going to have to pay some of the cost of that, which is really unfortunate. But some of this is just bad design. Some of it is just the growing pains of the nuclear sector. But I think even beyond Vogel, and this is something I think I'd like to query you about, is how you see nuclear developing in Europe. Because as I look at it and try and look at it from a global perspective, you mentioned the South Koreans are building nuclear plants in Abu Dhabi and El Baraka. I think they're now starting to produce power from El Baraka. This is going to be one of the biggest nuclear plants in the middle. It will be the biggest in the Middle East, one of the biggest in the world that's been built lately. I think that the nuclear comeback is going to happen in Europe and in Asia before it happens in the U.S., because we have this regulatory nightmare called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and we have natural gas today selling for less than $3 per million BTUs today. So, there's not a big imperative for the U.S. to go to nuclear that would be similar to what you see in France or Poland or Estonia or Romania or some of the countries in Europe that have been relying on gas and need reliable power. That they have, there's a bigger, and Britain as well, there's much bigger motivation behind nuclear in European countries than the US.
Well, I mean, the way I would see it is, I mean, particularly in France, France under de Gaulle, he had I think it was a prime minister or vice president or something by the name of Pierre Mesmer, who came with the Mesmer plan. And that was basically industrialized France within a very short period of time into nuclear.
Right.
So it was a long-term commitment. De Gaulle was a military-minded guy. So, he had the military industrial state behind him, given the Second World War was just over, and he was sort of transitioning the army to electricity supply. So a very good solution for France at the time.
Right.
That is the type of solution you unfortunately need, if you're going to go that way. So the thinking in France was, we're going to build one reactor, we're going to be very good at it, and we're just going to copy and paste it where it works.
Right.
Then, came the EPR, the European Pressure Water Reactor, where they jumped in bed with the Germans. As the Germans wanted to go out, the Germans imposed lots of safety and security onto them. And consequently, the price exploded. And that's why they can't even get one built in China, where there's no regulation to stop them. So that design, they need to get rid of it. France is now, I think this week, said they're going to go to the EPR2, which is similar to traditional designs. And if they can just get, the production process and the stuff right, it'll work. We know the technology works. It's proven. There's nothing to invent over there. It's to get a supply chains right. So that's sort of the way to go for it. But then, you speak to gas. Where I'm sitting here in Paris, we have the Paris Basin, one of the largest natural gas fields in the world. The French don't want to untap it, but Paris can be like Pennsylvania tomorrow if they untap it.
I knew that the resource was pretty big there, but I didn't realize it was that extensive. This is the shale in France is that good that they could start producing significant gas there.
And more importantly, the reason why Pennsylvania is so successful is your market is next door.
Right. Yeah.
So there's not a lot of transport. You just sell it directly to the customer. They can do it over here. We can sell the Germans gas because they might need it right now. But they don't do it because the Greens, they've got it in here as well.
Right.
It's a frustrating argument.
Well, but back on the EPR, but they did finish Akaluto, right? Akaluto has been up and running, but they've had some starting pains there as well in Finland. No, that that plant has had some problems.
And now they're talking about the welds in the reactors. I don't know what the story is about that there might not have been a high quality, and Framatome that the welding was fined for it. And now they're rechecking all the pipes in France because they're scared that it's going to crack as well. So there are issues with French nuclear. And the capacity factors are now running at 60% with the existing nuclear plants in France.
Right.
Offshore wind is 40%. So
Right.
your nuclear is becoming intermittent. So, I know Michael Schellenberger celebrates France's nuclear, and rightfully so. There's a lot to celebrate, but there are issues here as well.
Right.
And my view with the energy sector, sort of getting your view on this, has been natural gas is sort of like the midwife. It catches the baby whenever there's an issue with any of these technologies.
Uh-huh. I, I like that. I hadn't thought of it that way. That the midwife is there as the backstop to make sure the system works, and it does it very well. And I think that, back to your question about end to end, or your point, is this is the same policy I've been promoting now for 13 years. My fourth book, Power Hungry, I came out and said, this is the way forward. This is the best no regrets policy going forward. That both natural gas and nuclear are low or no carbon. The resources are very well known and established. That technologies are mature. There are many different companies that can develop them, and it will take time to transition to more nuclear around the world. But in the meantime, we have staggering quantities of natural gas on the planet. In fact, we don't even know how much there is, and there's a ton, 2 tons, 3 tons of stranded gas. I mean, look at these recent discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is one of the things that I think is, the real potential for Europe, if this Russian conflict continues, is build the East Med pipeline, carry gas from Israel and Egypt into the European market. That could be easily done, relatively easily. But they're in Africa, massive discoveries offshore, Tanzania, Senegal, huge deposits of
Mozambique,
natural gas. Mozambique, yeah. These are enormous, world-class deposits that can be developed, and they should be. And there's a lot of inertia that has to be overcome. There's a lot of government corruption that has to be dealt with. I mean, these aren't simple projects, and they won't be easy, but there's nothing easy when it comes to energy.
Yeah, and maybe that's also the point to remind the audience of. I mean, energy transitions, I think Vaclav Smil says it takes about 30, 40 years for an actual energy transition to take place. And, so what do you sort of say then to the UN, who says we're just in a transition now and we're going to be all green, solar, and wind tomorrow?
Well, it's not going to happen, Hugo. It's just not going to happen because of all the things we've discussed already. There's these land use conflicts that are key, that are already restraining the growth of renewables around the world. Second, if you even just ignore those land use conflicts, where are you going to get all the copper that you need? This is some of the work Simon Michaud was on my podcast, the Power Hungry podcast, a few weeks ago. And we talked about this, that he estimates that for the first generation of trying to move the entire world away from hydrocarbons, you would need the equivalent of something like 180 years of global copper production. And then that ignores then all the supply chain issues for neodymium iron boron magnets. Who controls the market for those? China. Who controls the market for rare earth elements of all kinds, including dysprosium, terbium, lanthanum, all these other rare earths that are key to so-called green technologies? China. So this idea that this is going to be easy or quick, or that the countries that are going to lead on this are going to somehow profit while the countries that lag are going to suffer is just not true. I see no evidence to support that. And I think in fact, Congress is holding hearings this week on some of these supply chain issues. And those are ones that I think have not gotten the kind of attention they deserve. But it is very clear that, and I'm not bashing China, not a China basher. China's going to take care of China, but they dominate. And the International Energy Agency just came out with a report on this in the Paris-based IEA, that documents this dominance that China has over virtually every different kind of energy transition technology, whether it's electrolyzers, electric cars, batteries, magnets, you name it.
And this is going to become an issue for national security. I mean, if I know anything about US politics, I mean, if you were in the CIA or one of these guys, look at this, you'd say, wait a minute, some of these supply chains must either move back home or we must find an alternative to it.
Of course. And this is a very key, these high strength magnets in particular are key to a wide range of military technologies, missiles, et cetera, and EVs, wind turbines. We're talking about tons of magnets that are needed for some of these large wind turbines. And the Chinese control more than 90% of the global market for neodymium iron boron magnets.
Oh, that's quite intense. So, I mean, isn't this then sort of the opportunity then for the nuclear industry to get their act together and say,
I think so, exactly.
But are they doing it? I mean, what are you seeing in the US? Like, are they? Why aren't they? Like, what is taking them so long? Like, what is the stumbling block there?
Well, first, I think, and I've thought about this quite a lot, and I was talking to a friend of mine, Rod Adams, about this just this morning, that when you think about the oil and gas industry, traditionally they've had a few kind of flamboyant and very colorful people like Boone Pickens, who was from Oklahoma, right? And I'm from Oklahoma as well. And so he was this sweet talking kind of tall guy, he was a corporate raider and he made billions of dollars, and he's very colorful. But he was an outspoken proponent for oil and gas, right? In the coal market, you had something similar where you had a few people who were, in out front in terms of promoting coal. Name one person in the US or anywhere around the world who is in the nuclear sector who's a real proponent for it. Maybe Mark Nelson, he's out of Chicago, but he's not really, he's an activist, right? He's not in the business, right?
Well, when I was studying nuke, so I did my master's in nuclear structures in France, and the engineers teaching me was saying nuclear is going to die. And I remember saying to these guys, you're teaching the future generation, like, don't believe in what you're studying, don't believe in your product. And that was actually the mentality even here. And I think that we need to overcome.
Absolutely. But I think, so those are the negatives. And I'll say very clearly, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, there has to be reform there because they are taking far too long to approve new reactor designs. NuScale Power last month got a design approval for their reactor. Hugo, it took them 6 years and cost them $500 million. I mean, it's just insane. I mean, how could you make your business?
It's not even a new design. It's just a small scale,
Exactly. It's just a shrunken light water reactor. So there's really nothing novel about it except that it's smaller, right? But it still took them 6 years and $500 million. And they submitted, the application itself was 12,000 pages. They added 2 million pages of supporting documents. I mean, how can you possibly run anything with that kind of bureaucracy? So the NRC is a problem. There's no doubt about it. But here's the positive side that I want to make sure, we look forward and think about, well, what's positive here? I think that there is a generational shift that's underway, that there is a new, younger generation that is adamantly pro-nuclear, and they're having success. They're having success here in the US. I see them having success in Europe. And I think this is going to happen, but I think it's going to have to happen. This nuclear comeback is going to have to occur in Europe and probably in Asia before it happens in the US.
Well, the interesting thing about the politics in Africa is the nuclear is not being driven. In the US, it's more of a conservative issue. In South Africa, it's actually the unions that are in favor of it. Right. Which is a very interesting phenomenon that's taken place. And it's very interesting to see this divide between our left, if you will, and the US left at the moment. They're talking two different languages. So we're going to see a reorientation, I think, of politics. And that's maybe a good thing that happens. I want to ask you one specific on nuclear, though.
If I could just interject one thing, because that is one of the things that I understand that in France was one of the reasons why nuclear did well, was that it had the support of the socialists and the unions, that de Gaulle and his allies went to them and said, hey, this is going to be a great source of, well-paying jobs for decades. It's not just a temporary thing. And so they had the very strong support of French labor behind nuclear from the very beginning. I've lost you.
I'm sorry, I said de Gaulle was clever because he put all the nuclear power stations in marginal districts as well. So the politicians could go against it.
Yeah.
But, that's how you do it. Because, that's the reason why Mélenchon lost his... one of the many reasons he lost the last election as well, because he was protesting against nuclear, and all the workers were like, wait a minute, you want to take my job away, you're a socialist? That didn't add up. I want to ask you one specific on nuclear. Have you looked into the linear no threshold model and whether that is legitimate, and radiation hormesis and anything of that sort?
Well, this is something that has been the problem for nuclear energy in the US for a long time, is that there's this claim that any exposure to radiation is bad. And it's just flat wrong. That there's linear no threshold, as I understand it. This is the claim that any exposure to radiation is dangerous. And it's just not true. And so the NRC has refused to reform itself when it comes to that claim. So, the reality is that our fear, and I'm working on a new film. It's called Burning Down the Grid. And one of the people we interviewed, Heather Hoff, she said something very poignant, which she said, it's not the radiation that's the problem. It's the fear of radiation that's the problem. Yeah. That our fear of radiation is more dangerous than the radiation itself. And I think that That's really quite an important statement.
My sister was one of the few English teachers that went to Fukushima after the disaster.
Mm,
And they had meters all over the class and stuff. And I asked her a few weeks ago, so what is the issue there? And she said, well, they picked up thyroid cancer in some people. It is there. It's not clear if it's due to the radiation, for the record, because, you're actively measuring it. So because some
right.
of us might have it. But nonetheless, there's been some cases of that. She said if she talks to the locals, they are so fed up of the Western media going there and trying to find a cancer death among a population of how many 100,000 that just isn't there. And thus far, until today, the Japanese government's only reimbursed one guy, for radiation causing cancer. And under Japanese law, if you can prove it, the government will reimburse you. So it's like an open ticket for any activist. So far, only one person has proven that radiation caused cancer of the entire population there. So, it's so exaggerated, the entire claim.
It is, and it's deeply unfortunate. But you can understand how these NGOs have used that and this fear of something you can't see, you can't smell, you can't taste
Tritium,
it, you can't feel
that's
them,
the latest one.
Right. It's the boogeyman, right? And so you can't, oh, well, gee, so be afraid, right? And that sells, right? Fear sells. And, nobody, as the famous line goes, nobody ever got elected by saying things are going to be okay, right? You've got to alert, you've got to have alarm to keep people motivated.
So, sort of this last question here. Anything that the audience can look forward to, and where do they find you? And so you read next article, next book, things of that sort.
Well, thank you. Yes. So I'm on Substack. I've moved to Substack recently. You mentioned Michael Schellenberger. He's kind of shown the way how to do this. And so along with other people I admire, like Roger Pilkey Jr. and Doomberg, who I've had on my podcast. In fact, we'll be releasing a podcast with Doomberg, who's doing remarkably well on Substack. So robertbryce.substack.com, robertbryce.substack.com. Go ahead and subscribe. It's free. And then I'm on the web, robertbryce.com. And I also do the Power Hungry podcast, which I have a great fun doing. And I've had our mutual friend Joel Kotkin on to talk about demographics and issues of class in America, who I think we both have great regard for him. So I have great fun with the podcast, and I'm passionate about these issues. I mean, these are the issues that I'm dedicated to, and I am going to be spending the rest of my life working on, because energy and power are the most important issues in our society, and we screw them up at our extreme peril.
Okay, well, Robert, thank you very much for this conversation. And everyone, please follow him, Substack, look at his books, watch Juice, very informative movie. I really enjoyed it. And thank you for giving me half an hour of your time. I appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure, Hugo. Anytime.